Maya Besharov, Professor of Organizations and Impact here at Said Business School, and also the Academic Director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all here today for the Insights for Action seminar. The seminar series more broadly focuses on how researchers and practitioners within and beyond Oxford are using research insights for action. And today, we're going to be talking about refugee entrepreneurship, the state of the field, the innovation potential of entrepreneurs who have a migrant or refugee background, and what lessons working in this field can offer for leadership, organizing, and funding of social innovation and social impact more broadly. And I am joined by two fantastic individuals for today's conversation, Dr. Asma Naimi and Professor Farah Kodeh. I will introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll get into the conversation. Asma is a writer and social entrepreneur who's passionate about combining knowledge and creativity to drive social change. She focuses on how social entrepreneurship can play a role in catalyzing change that spans borders, that addresses issues of migration, poverty, inequality, and injustice. She did her PhD at ISADA Business School, and after finishing her PhD, she founded an organization called the Changemaker Studio, which focuses on the power of storytelling for social change and on surfacing social entrepreneurship at the margins. Asma is also project lead for the All In program, which aims to create more inclusion in the social entrepreneurship movement broadly. I'm also joined by Farah, who's Associate Professor of Strategy at IESEG Business School or School of Management in Paris. Farah's research looks at how organizations and individuals navigate repressive and exclusionary institutions. This includes looking at the profound challenges faced by asylum seekers and refugees in their host countries, and also examining collective and organizational initiatives that aim to support these individuals. Farah also has research on democratic backsliding, on civil society organizations and other organizations that are advocating for marginalized communities, and she looks at the dynamics of collective resistance in these contexts. So very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
And we're going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to some questions and discussion from all of you here in person and also those of you joining online. So I want to start by just talking a little bit and having each of you share a little bit about what we mean by refugee entrepreneurship and what's the sort of state of the field, what's going on in this space. Farah, I'll start with you. So your work is broadly in this area of refugee entrepreneurship and thinking about how innovation occurs in these contexts as well. Tell us more about who you're working with, the context you're working in, and what are the questions that you're grappling with in these contexts?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, this is a good question. So I have been doing research in multiple contexts. And the focus has always been how refugee and migrant entrepreneurs and communities more generally face challenges when they are rebuilding their lives in their host societies, and how can organizations, but even governments, support them, or what kind of solutions they provide to support them. So some of my work has been like focused on access to employment, but some other work has been actually also how to support the entrepreneurship and livelihood sustenance. And different contexts I have looked at. The first context was looking at one NGO who provided small grants to Syrian refugees in refugee camps in Lebanon so that they could set up their small businesses through these small grants. Another context is Finland, where I lived for 3 years, and I looked at multiple NGOs that were supporting mostly high growth, so entrepreneurship and startups among refugee communities, but also other communities from a migrant background and underprivileged groups. And more recently, I have started looking at the French landscape, where a lot of initiatives are also proliferating in that area. Some of the questions that I ask myself, well, these contexts are very different, so they provide really different contexts for refugee integration and entrepreneurship, and the barriers and the challenges faced are not the same in these contexts. So, for example, in France and Finland are closer in terms of the bureaucratic and legal barriers that refugees might face when they want to set up their own businesses. They have issues sometimes accessing social networks and funding, but still they might consider entrepreneurship because they consider it as an easier way to get to the labor market than formal employment. And of course, we know that funding is an issue for any type of entrepreneur, not just refugee entrepreneurs. But what we see is this, it's even more of a barrier for refugees because of all the legal barriers and the difficulty to access banking and credit services. So that's, there are some similarities in the French and the Finnish context. What I witnessed in Lebanon is completely different because the entrepreneurship there has been completely informal, set up inside refugee camps through small grants. And it's mostly a way actually to counter outright prohibitions and restrictive regulations. So for example, Syrian refugees in Lebanon cannot have a work permit. So that's the only way they can sustain their livelihood is by creating these informal initiatives within informal settlements and camps. But what we see also is that inside these camps, there's a whole informal economy that's supported by refugee entrepreneurs. Just maybe two quick points is that some of the issues that I see is are related to the effectiveness and sustainability of these initiatives. So, for example, it was clear for me that high growth and startup focused entrepreneurship in Finland was not necessarily what refugees wanted or even needed. They wanted to set up their own small businesses and maybe rapid access to employment. So there are like these companies and social entrepreneurs that come with like great ideas, but that do not always cater to the needs of the communities. What I also see is that, and this is more based on my studies in Lebanon, is the sustainability of these initiatives. So, of course, people end up with setting up their small businesses thanks to the small grants. But then, how far can they take beyond this initial push of these non-governmental organizations? And even the sustainability of the programs themselves, because NGOs often work with the project-based funding. So what we see is that these type of initiatives can provide this temporary relief, but it's not necessarily a durable solution. So a lot of questions actually come from these different contexts.
Absolutely. We'll come back to some of the different kinds of interventions and their implications in a minute. But Asma, let me turn to you. Tell us a little bit about your work, who you're working with, the context you're working in.
Yeah. Well, also, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to join this conversation today. And just to also add to Farah, so my focus is on social entrepreneurship. So I've been working in the field of social entrepreneurship very broadly. That can be anyone who wants to start an initiative, an activity. It can be a foundation or an enterprise, but really to solve a social problem. And what we've seen is that when we are supporting social entrepreneurs from migrant communities, that there are some patterns that, even though the contexts differ, there are some patterns that overlap and that we want to highlight based on our research that I did for my PhD. So I compared the context of some regions in the US with European countries and looked at migrant populations and how they themselves, through their initiatives that we call social entrepreneurship, address migration issues. I worked for an incubator in the Middle East and Africa. I did research for the OECD on the transit routes where migrant initiatives pop up as well to fill in certain gaps in the support that is offered, and also looked at fragile contexts such as Sudan, where you see that there is a lot of conflict and fragility, and also refugee entrepreneurship arises. And although the contexts are different, you do see some similarities in the work that they do. So because they're very closely related and they have lived experience and knowledge about the topics that and the communities that they serve, they are much more effective and humane in the way they do that. So the questions that I'm more grappling with is, why is that not recognized so much by institutional supporters or funders or support organizations? And how can we really support the impact that people are making in grassroots communities? How can we learn from that that? How can we create a more empathic and human-centered focus in our interventions when we try to help refugee populations? And finally, also, how can we battle, this stigmatization and often exclusionary practices due to biases that we have on the capacity of certain populations? So we need to really also change the narrative in that sense. So that's why also my focus on storytelling is that you really see that coming up in all the research that I did. It's something that really limits their access to funding, their access to networks and collaborations. So in very difficult circumstances, there are some very impactful initiatives, and how can we make sure that we can leverage that? I think that's something that I work on. And one of the things is to translate this very complex knowledge that we have about these systems through creative ways of talking about it and making sure that people can use that knowledge in practice and effectively.
Okay, great. So you both talked about various kinds of interventions, and I want to ask about this within what is, I think, a pretty broad field of refugee entrepreneurship. There's lots of different kinds of organizations that are intervening, lots of different kinds of interventions, humanitarian organizations, governments, corporations, others. What's driving these investments? What's their value? And how do they play out? Farah?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, because I think one thing is that we're seeing these refugee flows. I mean, when we look at the latest report by UNHCR, we're talking about over, I think, 108 million people who have been forcibly displaced to escape persecution, war, and other human rights abuses. Over 12 million, I think, of them have settled in Europe. And so that means governments, organizations have to look for ways to understand, but also manage these flows. And this is one of the issues where multiple interventions and multiple stakeholders have to join forces to find solutions together, because not one organization will be able to handle it alone, and not one set of actors. And so if we look at how things have evolved, even though the narrative is pretty much negative because of political dimensions, there's been a shift in terms of the approach to forcible displacement from providing humanitarian aid and assistance to more developmental approach, like helping refugees rebuild their lives while at the same time contributing to host societies. So this can be done through entrepreneurship, obviously, but also access to employment. And so whether it's one or the other, I think that the point is, how can we integrate these refugees in their host societies so that we can foster social cohesion? And of course, the economic considerations are never too far. Like, we have to think also of the economic benefits of these initiatives. And so why entrepreneurship in particular? I think through my work, but also when we look at the literature, we see that entrepreneurship is often seen as a way for refugees to become self-reliant, less dependent on aid. Through my research, what I could see is that it provides meaning, that they can foster this more hopefulness in the future. They can regain control, some sort of control over their narrative, their lives, their future. For the community, refugees often create jobs for like-minded people, for other vulnerable groups. They have this empathy. And so they can actually contribute to inclusion also more broadly. So it can contribute in a lot of different levels. Yeah, so I think this is one area where we're seeing a lot of different initiatives coming from the private sector, from nonprofit sector, from the public sector, but also this is what I'm advocating for, and I think I'll come back to it later when we talk about action. Business schools should contribute also to this ecosystem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Asma, perspectives on the different kinds of interventions, what's behind them? You've alluded to some things that work and also that don't work.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I totally underline what Farah has just said, is that we need all the different types of interventions because they bring different added value to the ecosystem. So what we've seen is, for example, that people talk about it in two different ways. I call it the business case. for migration and the social case for migration, and both have their advantages and disadvantages. So the business case is very clear. People come with talents and skills. They're not being used very effectively at the moment, but if we can create a system that really puts people in the right place and integrates them through economic inclusion, through work or entrepreneurship, this can have a great economic value for host country societies. And I think in that sense, the private sector has been very proactive and really addressed that opportunity, but it has also a disadvantage in the sense that it can, if we only look at refugees as bringing economic value, and that's the reason why they're allowed to, you know, participate in society, we are actually perpetuating a system that is unequal. So then you have the social case, as I call it, which is about our moral obligation to support refugees, you know, the universal human rights, etc. And I think that's also a very strong point, of course, and we need to develop moral leadership and ambition as business schools, as political actors, as different kind of ecosystem actors. But you often see that it still perpetuates power imbalances. So you have the benefactors, the ones that do good, the ones that give and help and support, and then you have the beneficiaries, and those are always the poor, victimized refugees. And this narrative really needs to change as well. So I think that is something that that I'm very conscious of. And when to answer your question more directly, if you look at, you know, local initiatives, grassroots initiatives that I focused on, and people with a migrant background, activists, they are very responsive. They have a very strong network in their communities. They can really quickly, when a conflict or something, a war breaks out, really quickly react and provide support needed. But when you look at the private sector, it can actually economically skill entrepreneurship initiatives. But when you look at the public sector policies and legislations, you need that to legitimize certain approaches and create more sustainable funding. So in that sense, we need everyone, because, but we have to be mindful of how we talk about certain groups. Yeah.
Anything you want to add on this?
No, I just want to double down on this. Like also refugees are not a monolith group. They come from different backgrounds, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of like socioeconomic profiles. And one thing I always want to do as a researcher is always be mindful of their conditions, their experiences, how they talk about the structural barriers that they're facing, instead of like imposing established categories and narratives on them. So. And I think this is how we can have more successful initiatives, when you do things from their perspective, try to understand what they need and what are, instead of like having assumptions about the resources and conditions that would help them succeed. And not seeing them just in this framework like benefactor and beneficiaries, but more like co-create with them, which is what the ESMA is very much involved in. Yeah,
absolutely. And this connects to the next sort of set of questions I wanted to get into, which is really around sort of understanding migrants and individuals with a refugee background. What you've talked about the importance of sort of understanding that perspective, the experience, the voice. And I want to ask you a little bit about sort of what is it that makes these individuals unique as problem solvers, as innovators, and what is it that you learned from really trying to tap into their experiences?
Yeah, I want to say a lot of things, but I really want to start with like a cautious, also connected to what we just discussed, like, because I often hear when I talk to different social entrepreneurs, but also tech entrepreneurs, that refugees have an entrepreneurial mindset, like it's just an assumption. And so they are well suited for entrepreneurship. And I even once had a discussion with a tech entrepreneur who told me, well, they have traveled 4,000 kilometers from their hometown, went through hell, so that means they take risks and they must have the entrepreneurial drive. And when you talk to the refugees themselves, yeah, some of them are well suited for entrepreneurship, but not everybody, and not everybody want to actually embark on this very risky entrepreneurial journey. Some people are just looking to sustain livelihood, or just access to employment, safety. And so we need to also break down this narrative where like they have traveled a lot, done a lot of horrible, went through horrible things, so they must be very successful entrepreneurs. And I think some of these assumptions are based also on the research on migrant entrepreneurship, which looks at migrant entrepreneurship and immigrant entrepreneurship, and which does not focus specifically on refugees. And I think it's important to make the difference. And there are calls in the literature to actually start differentiating between these groups, because refugees have not traveled because they're looking for economic or business opportunities. Their migration is based on a completely, like the nature of their mobility is different, and the process it's forced. And the assumption we might have also as researchers is because of the forced nature of their migration, this could impact the way they engage in entrepreneurship and other economic activity, labor activity. So these are things we need to sort out also as researchers, and questions that we have to deal with, like what assumptions hold and what assumptions don't hold. So that said, we've been looking at multiple initiatives, and refugees are obviously succeeding as entrepreneurs in multiple countries and multiple different contexts. And what we see is that they do bring like their lived experience, some ethnic capital. I have a friend and colleague, Sophia Al-Khalid, at Lancaster University, doing work on craftwork, traditional craftwork by Syrian refugee women who live in the UK, not just as a way to sustain livelihood, but also as a way to transmit these traditions to their children and also to the host community. So this is a way of using some ethnic capital to reconnect with the past, but also like engage with the host communities. What we also see is like a bunch of behavioral skills that are mentioned in different studies and reports, including like resilience, adaptability, hard work, work ethic, and so bringing different perspectives to problem solving and entrepreneurship. And of course, all the empathy that refugees bring. So because, you know, then they end up actually hiring people who have a similar experience, other vulnerable group, and them contributing by doing that to inclusion more broadly in the host country. So yeah, these are some of the things that I've seen in my own research, but I've also witnessed in different literatures that I've read.
Absolutely. Any thoughts on this?
It's hard to add anything else. It was very comprehensive, and I think mentioned many points that are relevant. So I was thinking of maybe giving an example for the audience of what I've seen in my research. So I think it's completely right. We should not put everyone in one group, but what you do see is that when people have certain boundary conditions, and I have to say that for our research that were a lot of highly educated people with a refugee background that had a social inclination, and they used their let's say the bridge that they built to different cultural backgrounds, they use that actually as a way to create opportunities that people who come from a local perspective, they couldn't, and based on their lived experiences, be more humane. And one of the examples that I had in my research was from a restaurant owner that was giving a job placement for refugees with minor refugees, so under 18, because often what you see is when they have to go to camps and they are there for 2 years and they're not allowed to work and they have to wait for their papers, like a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety and other problems arise. So it just makes it worse. So the faster you integrate people into society, the more successful they can also be, and the more their well-being also improves. So it was at that time in the Netherlands was not allowed to place those young people in jobs, but he did it anyway because he couldn't take the pain and the suffering that he was seeing. And then when he saw that they can learn the language on the job, they have a sort of family where they belong with people from similar backgrounds. So they're not like just thrown into a host country and say, okay, figure it out, but really, you know, supporting them as I would say as a family. You know, I think this was a big concept in his restaurant. He showed that these young people were, very successful in getting other jobs and pursuing their futures. And then we went to the municipality to say, hey, this is what I did. Look how it works. And it's been very successful, and got legislation passed to make sure that these young people can be placed for jobs. So this is just a very, it seems very small, but it's such a huge thing someone did, and it took risk that, I think it really creates institutional change also, matching everything you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you used this example
Yeah.
because you just told us a story and you talked about the power of storytelling. So I want to ask you to just unpack this a little bit. And, why narrative, why storytelling? How have you seen that? How are you using it? How does it work? Why does it work? What does it offer that more traditional ways of measuring the impact of various kinds of interventions just can't provide?
I think that people are overwhelmed by the amount of negative news that we are reaching. And I think that the alarmistic ways of people trying to convey, and I think it's very relevant and it should happen, it overwhelms people. So what I looked at in my research is how people process information. And you see that they feel helpless and they disconnect and they just continue what they're doing and they are not mobilized and they don't feel the empathy. People are dehumanized when we talk in these large figures and these large numbers. So when I tell these kind of stories, people actually think, oh, that's what we're talking about. And oh, that's actually someone I know and that's someone in my neighborhood. So there's an emotional human connectivity that plays a role while grasping, these large mega problems that we're facing. I think it's similar for climate change. I have this movie, Don't Look Up. I think many people have seen it, right? It's where Leonardo DiCaprio is an environmental scientist and tells people the world is ending and just blank because it's impossible to grasp that on an individual level. So really connecting that individual with the meta, I think that's where storytelling comes in and activates people's awareness, changes people's perceptions towards one another, and creates that sense of empathy. And what people often forget in storytelling is if you want to if you want to use storytelling for social change, which is my focus area, you have to really have a concrete call to action that is in the sphere of influence of people that they can actually do. So if you are talking about big reports and big data, people feel like they don't know how to do that in their own sphere of influence. So I think that's something you always have to end with when you're telling these stories.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to come back to a call to action at the end. Now I know why you asked us to ask that. Okay, so but before we go there, I want to start to zoom out a bit and ask you to both think about the implications from the work that you do in this area for understanding social entrepreneurship and innovation more broadly. And for us at the Skoll Center and for many of us who work in this space, this is both really important in itself, and we think it probably has a lot to offer the social innovation and social change world more broadly. And so I just want to start to explore that a little bit. And so Farah, maybe I'll start with you. Tell us about some of the insights from your work that you think can be helpful for understanding leadership, organizing, and funding social innovation and change more broadly.
Yeah, well, I can think of two things. Mostly one big insight I would say comes from the research I did with Tom Lawrence, who's in the audience here, hello, and Henry Shield at Aalto University in Finland. So one of the biggest challenges that refugees face and is the this extreme uncertainty that they experience. They are uprooted from their past, but also like they don't know what the future looks like, and it's often like when they envision it, it's like quite bleak and uncertain, and this is extremely crippling. So what I have seen is that this, connecting to what Asma was saying earlier, people can get into depression, anxiety, a sense of like apathy, passivity, powerlessness, and they don't know what to do. It can really like cripple them. And so one of the things that I've seen looking at this organization and the small grants program and the entrepreneurial program that they were running is that this is one way to ease this experience of uncertainty, because people can then connect to like short-term goals, daily routines and activities, a community, a stable context, a stable environment. And so I think, okay, this was an example of extreme uncertainty and disruption, but it can have broader, I guess, relevance for leadership, for anybody who wants to even understand and cope with their own experience of uncertainty. But I think right now we're living in really turbulent and uncertain times, and this could be, these insights from the research could be a way for leaders to think of how we can improve well-being of employees. I'm thinking of employees in uncertain and precarious jobs could be also experiencing such extreme uncertainty. So So broader relevance to we really understand how we can ease and alleviate this experience of uncertainty and provide people with the tools and avenues to cope with this and, have like the stable holding environment. One other even like broader issue would be like how we understand diversity and inclusion in organizations. I think refugees are among the most marginalized social groups. They really like disproportionately experience and face discrimination. They have really limited access to information, opportunities, and all sorts of resources that other affluent individuals have access to. And I think if we look at refugee entrepreneurs who succeeded, who have made it, and there are a bunch of examples, it's interesting to look at like what are the structural barriers that they faced, how they understand them, what has worked and what hasn't worked in their experience to become refugee entrepreneurs. And this could help organizations also, and even social entrepreneurship more broadly, understand how we can devise better, more inclusive policies and not just instrumental policies that look good on paper. So I think it could have really multiple implications. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Asma, implications that you want to share from your work?
I think if we want to see what this brings the whole field of social entrepreneurship, I think it's very clear that if we want to change the current system and the current, I think, power relations that we see in the world, we need to include new voices and actually give them also ownership and influence in our process, in developing new processes. And I think that even you can see that in the social entrepreneurship field, there's a divide. There are some usual suspects always invited for, these big events. We all know each other. It's normal. It's human. You invite people, invite people who you work with, but there has to be like a breaking point where we say, no, people with lived experience, people from marginalized communities, they need a seat at the table so that we can together, with a diversity of talent and skills, look at the challenges that we're facing in the world, be it either migration, refugee, climate, and say, how can we create a more equitable new pathway towards change? And I think that these social entrepreneurs, mostly, I think more than only, refugee entrepreneurs, but they really have this, holistic perspective of how big societal problems affect people in very marginalized communities. I think without that, you cannot really change sustainably. I think that's what we need to learn from that. And then exactly what Farah has said, access to network, influential, powerful networks, access to finance, these kind of things, I hear them all the time. Like they start something, they need to be able to scale it, and they need to be appreciated for it. So we often develop incubators and say we need to develop skills of entrepreneurs and we need to help them navigate. It's super important, but we need to develop the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging skills of support organizations. And maybe that's now even more needed because we have so many initiatives that focus on the entrepreneur, but we need initiatives that focus on the institutional actors around them. Yeah.
Okay, I want to pick up on this because I'm in complete agreement about the importance of bringing in the lived experience, the diverse voices, and you both know this, right? Doing that is very hard, right? And very tricky. And so I want to ask you if there's approaches or processes that you've seen in your work that have enabled that to work well in this context.
Yeah, just a very short example is that we're co-creating a new funding round for projects from these communities, and we're testing like applications, like anonymously applying jury selection process of deciding who gets funding. And it's there's not much research on that process yet. So we're trying to see, does this lead to different outcomes? Does it lead to different initiatives being funded in our social sector? So, and also making sure that the juries are diverse in themselves, and making sure that they have different backgrounds, different lenses. I think that's important, putting content over language proficiency. I see that we put too much emphasis on structure and format and not enough emphasis on experiential knowledge and informal experiences that lead to some people being able to do things better than maybe, I have a PhD, but sometimes a PhD is not the right thing to have, and you actually need to have the experience working on the ground is much more important. So I think that's we need to value, change our, the way we value in these selection procedures that are often, quite standardized, I think, still. Yeah. So, but it's still work in progress. So in practice, you see that you can't do everything. You have limited time, you have limited money, you have to make choices. And the two choices that I think we can never forget is co-creation and really diversified selection procedures with the least amount of bias. You cannot completely, but try to limit. I think that's some, lessons learned.
I can talk about a recent experience. So we had this fostering refugee inclusion workshop at my school at ESAG actually a few months ago. And the whole idea was to bring different stakeholders together to discuss refugee inclusion, including researchers, but also people from the public, private sector. And of course, while designing the whole workshop, it was very important to feature the voices of the refugees themselves. So it's very important on each of the panels that we have one or two people who talk about their own experiences going through the hurdles of, getting access to employment or setting up their own businesses or getting into education again. So this is one way also where, we need to have these kind of events where, all the actors, stakeholders are there, but the people who are concerned by these initiatives must be able to have a seat on the table and tell their own experiences from their own perspectives.
And I just want to add quickly is that people say it's difficult. We cannot find, the right people. It's very hard. They don't know, but it's actually because you're not connected to the right community. So you need to find those brokers, those people who build bridges that have one foot in one foot in the other, and ask them to go find. And that's how I also did it in my PhD research. Is we were working with Ashoka, and we were saying, okay, how do social entrepreneurs from a migrant background deal with migration? And we looked in their fellowship and who was a member, and there was very few. So we had to go and find it in our own network, Google, proactively call people, really go to the communities, and then one person recommends you to another. And now I see it everywhere. And I think, and they actually started to build these groups, proactively. So I think that was one of the things that we said, it's not hard, but you have to make an effort.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so last question, and then we'll open it up to questions from those of you here and those of you on Zoom. What if you could just offer one final message, what would that be? What would your call to action be for people working in this field?
I'll go.
Go ahead.
I don't know. I'll start because as a business school professor, I feel like we need to leverage business school as a platform for change. If you think of it, we have the expertise. Look at the people around us. We have connections with companies, with the entrepreneurial ecosystems, with entrepreneurs, with incubators, etc. But we also have connections with local actors and governmental representatives. So we can really act as a platform for change. But and I was thinking actually that recently in the Financial Times, we were talking about it yesterday. There was a ranking of the business schools that are doing really well in terms of sustainability and responsible education. And I think Said Business School ranked really highly. So congrats. And also my school where I am based was highly ranked. So we are doing well. And so it means we have what it takes to make a difference. But I think most importantly, we have a bunch of students who keep telling us that they want to change the world, that they want to make a difference. So they have the cultural capital, resources, and we can just leverage and make a difference and make entrepreneurial ecosystems more inclusive by contributing to the conversation and having a bigger seat at the table as business school.
That's super important. I think that everybody can do something in their sphere of influence, but the one thing that has been I've been preoccupied with the last few weeks, because in the Netherlands where I'm based, we had extreme right party win a big part of the votes, and 1 in 4 people have voted for extreme right. And it really, I have to say, it didn't even make me angry. It made me incredibly sad that we live in a place where this is happening, and we are trying to do good and trying to create social impact, and still we feel like on a meta level things are really deteriorating. And I've been really thinking about, okay, what can we do? And I think the the only thing that really gives me hope in these times is that we connect with people who are very different from ourselves. And I think that we are all in our own bubble, and also the projects that I lead are often with people who are already, I'm preaching to the converted. So I don't feel like that's where I'm making my impact. So I would say everybody go talk to people that you don't know, that you don't understand, that feel different, that maybe even feel sometimes hostile. Please take care of your safe space, but make sure that you talk to one another. And I think that's where the magic happens, as one of the social entrepreneurs told me, is when you empathize with each other. And I think we're forgetting a big part is social class. So even when we speak about, the most successful social entrepreneurs, they're often highly educated. And, I think that there is still a lot we can do and to bridge, those social classes and reach them. And I also look at myself. So we have to all do our best to reach each other. Yeah.
And I will say just a quick story to elaborate on what you just described, because you told us last night at dinner how the morning after the vote, you went into one of the local shops and you were nervous.
Yes.
Because you thought, well, a quarter of the people voted for this party, and, is the shop owner one of them, right? And it was the human interaction with him about a question about what you were buying that sort of broke that tension and that anxiety and allowed you to connect in a very human way as two human beings, both of whom were concerned about the future of the country.
Yeah, and also the future of their children. I think that's where we connected when we were talking about our own children. And I just saw this caring man just, doing his business it's also about your own perception. Like such an election result can have a big influence. At least in my life, it has always had a big influence, because I feel my identity is often politicized. Even if I don't want to, it still happens. It's not always in my control. And then when I talk to owner of a shop in nearby, and I see that we can connect, I say, okay, we are still in a community that cares about each other, and we need to foster that. So yeah, that was something that was very real. Yeah, very real.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you both. I want to open it up to questions from those of you here in the room, and those of you joining online. If you pop questions in the chat, Jessica will pick them up and feed them back to us. Okay, and I'm going to repeat the question for the benefit of those who are joining online. The question was about case examples or case studies of successful refugee entrepreneurship, what that looks like, what kind of businesses are being built.
Well, I can think of actually two people that I invited recently actually to that event that I mentioned earlier at my school. Two refugee entrepreneurs who came to talk about their experiences. One created a company called Welcome Account. So it's a way to access funding, alternative funding for refugees and even entrepreneurs from migrant background, because of all the legal obstacles that I discussed earlier and their difficulty to access banking services. So it's like an inclusive way of getting access to funds. So that's one initiative that I can think of. And I think they're really still in the process of trying to get the funding to kickstart the whole thing. Another person discussed a social initiative that she created. It's a way to include people based on art. So it's a social initiative where, the idea is to just like visit different museums in Paris. Paris is a big city with a lot of culture, a lot of museums. So why not leverage all that culture to foster integration and inclusion and get to know the host country that you're living in by getting to know the culture. So these are two brilliant initiatives that I can talk about. But there are so many actually, and it's hard to choose, but those were on my mind because they were recently mentioned.
In our Ashoka report, we have 6 case studies listed. You can take a look. To mention 2, we have a self-funded community. So instead of reaching out and, taking welfare, you see that the dignity of a lot of groups, they feel better when they are putting, saving their own money and then one by one using it for their own dreams, projects, etc. That was something very strong. And yeah, I mean, even tech entrepreneurs that develop like an educational app to make sure that children in refugee populations can still develop. I think it was also about emotionally developing and dealing with social media and identity building, etc. So these kind of courses were very important. Yeah, there are so many. I don't, yeah. I think you can find them in every sector, almost every topic.
Other questions? Yes. So I'll just repeat the question again. So the first part is about, have you seen that in refugee entrepreneurship and initiatives, that it's mainly people who come from a refugee background who are engaged? And are there ways of engaging more broadly with people from a wider range of backgrounds and experiences?
So what I've seen often, what happens is that initiatives and organizations, NGOs that are creating these initiatives are focused on refugees, but also on broader groups. They want to involve other marginalized social groups, but also members from host communities. Like one organization I've been in touch with in France, the focus is on migration. So what they do is that they hire a lot of refugees who want to set up their own businesses, but also members of the host community, so French people who want to create initiatives to support refugee entrepreneurship. So then the focus is clear, but it's also open to diverse social groups. And the same with all the initiatives I have witnessed. For example, in Lebanon, in refugee camps, because these initiatives were set in Palestinian refugee camps, so it was open to Syrian refugees, but also to existing Palestinian refugees who have been living there for ages. So it's always like the people who are setting up these initiatives are always mindful that it should be open to different social groups and not just exclusively on refugees, because you also want to create this exchange between different communities. So that's, I guess, the first part of the question. Maybe I'll let Asma deal with the second part.
Well, I think you've sort of, the answer, the second part may not be so relevant, because what you're suggesting is that in the initiatives you've worked with, there actually is quite a bit of openness and engagement and efforts to really be inclusive of more groups, not just the particular refugee group that is leading or starting the initiative.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, you see that the most effective ones are local and refugee-led, because I've had many examples of refugee-led initiatives going to a bank, not getting the loan, but when they go with a local person, suddenly the dynamic changes and they're perceived differently. So we have to, in that sense, also be pragmatic and say, okay, who has power where, and let's make initiatives that collaboratively are reaching their goals, I guess.
So the question is about, are there tensions between sort of being and identifying as a refugee and building an enterprise that is very much a refugee enterprise, and trying to become part of the country where you are now and really sort of shift your identity and perhaps also your legal status in various ways?
And does that undermine the organization you may have started as a refugee?
Can I say something? Yeah, because identity was something that came in every interview that I had with entrepreneurs from a refugee background. I personally don't like the word refugee entrepreneurs, to be honest, because it's very, homogeneous when it's not. There's like super diversity in that. And when do you stop being a refugee was something that all of the people were talking about. They said, I am not only a refugee, but now I'm labeled like that. So now I have to constantly say, hi, I am and I'm a refugee, and this is where I come from, and I have to tell my story over and over again, but nothing really happens. I still don't have access to funding, So in the end, I think people don't want to be a refugee entrepreneur. They just want to be an entrepreneur, and they just want to do good for their communities if they're social, or just set up a successful business. And I hope that's where we're going to end. But the identity part, I think, that's what I meant with the victimizing approach of the social case. When we are, saying we need to help those refugees entrepreneurs, we're actually also victimizing them and putting them in that kind of category when they don't really want to be there, but sometimes they also need to use it so that they can start their initiatives. So they're always in this very weird, lower power level in a way. So they always have to present themselves in a way to get the funding. And I think that's something maybe we can actually create some change in how we approach that. But once they're, working for 10, 20 years, they can, maybe they stop being a refugee. I think that would be very good.
Yeah, I'm not going to add too much to that, but I witnessed the same dynamic where people, and I had informal conversations with people before actually getting into interviews in my research, and they don't like being even called refugees. A lot of them see it as very negative term. And like it's this big basket where you put everybody together and you don't recognize people's differences and experiences. And of course, we're guilty of that as researchers because these are the terms that we use. Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult question, but I did see it in a lot of different settings where people are like, yeah, maybe we should not be considered or called refugees anymore, and people should just look at our skills, experiences, lives. You know, we are just people, humans, like everybody else. So that label sometimes comes with a lot of baggage and negative connotations, unfortunately.
Well, and I will just say the question and your comments has surfaced one of sort of two challenges for Jessica and myself as we set up the seminar, which is refugee and entrepreneurship, both of which we struggled with because, and you've talked about the refugee aspect of that, right? How maybe we should really just be thinking about these people as individuals, as human beings, as entrepreneurs. We also struggle with the entrepreneurship aspect because there's obviously some much broader structural shifts that need to happen to not get us into the place where we have refugees who are engaging in entrepreneurial activity in the first place. And so we want to make sure that we highlight, maybe this is a good time to do it, so the challenges of both aspects of really the topic that we're talking about, the refugee term, but also the focus on entrepreneurship, and not lose sight of the broader picture and the broader set of shifts that really we need to be working towards. We have time for one or two more questions. Let me just ask if there's any from the Zoom chat.
There are. I may collapse them a little bit. The first one around best practices in relation to technology. So first, best practices around using tech for capacity building or education programs to teach entrepreneurship and business models. And the second one around funding and financing. And the other question is, we haven't talked that much about our government. So beyond working around them, what should we be asking of them?
I'll let you go for the tech and funding part.
Why don't you just repeat the theme as you start? Well, the best practices around tech and around funding.
Yeah, I think that tech is everywhere. You can use it for good and for bad and for everything in between. So yeah, refugees use that as well. I think it mostly is about accessing, you know, knowledge and skills that incubators can provide and making sure that it reaches certain groups. They can, you know, for low cost, learn online, for example. So I think it's very similar to what we also as educational institutes can do or NGOs can bring. And I think that, there are young or new generation people who use social media very proactively also to reach, you know, their own groups. So I think there are some best practices there. But still, for the access to funding, I find it difficult. So what I just mentioned is the self-funded communities and these kind of initiatives. I think there's a lot of power in that. But the most institutional access to funding approaches that they have, they are still the same. It's like big funds from, you know, well-known groups that can really shift, and the rest is more, still very small grants. And it's also something that I wanted to say about the term entrepreneurship. It's so broad that I always have to explain what I do. So I always say it's people who start activities and initiatives to create impact. And there's, you know this, there's a spectrum of funding that is specific to the needs of a certain entrepreneur at a certain stage, depending on what they want to do. And we have to maybe look at that more deeply. So a grant is great if you have an idea and you want to test it, but at a certain point you need investments to scale, etc. So I think there's a lot still to do on that investment and scaling part when there are still a lot of donation and grant. I think we have that for targeting refugee entrepreneurs. But on the other hand, you still see that, they're maybe still not recognized as successful entrepreneurs in general, speaking.
Was there another part to the question that we didn't yet tackle?
Policy.
The government.
Sorry.
No, Jessica, go ahead.
Well, the other question is about government. So
Yes.
working about the.
Yeah.
Do you want to take this on? Ira?
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, I mean, we've witnessed the same, trend in France now with the adoption of a very restrictive immigration law. So the government, when we look at it like as government, and the general discourse is quite negative and not helpful, and even like putting roadblocks everywhere. When we talk to civil society and NGOs in France, they tell us how, yeah, it's not making their job any easier. They used to have access to a lot of funding from the government, and these resources are dwindling. At the same time, because we know that governments also do that, there are like small initiatives in government. So in France, there's like a part of the foreign affairs minister that, there's one specific group focused specifically on refugee inclusion and how we can, work on their employability, on their access to education, on their access to diverse opportunities. And so these people, we always want to invite to different events and talk to them and see with them what works, what doesn't work, but also what they need from us as researchers. They have huge needs in terms of understanding certain things, certain trends, and they want to work with economists. They also want to work with organizational scholars like me to understand, more like the interpretations, the lived experiences of different people. So those are the actors that we try to focus on, and we can build a lot of collaborations with them, and they're very interested in the work that is done in this area. Despite the meta discourse that is very corrosive and negative and polarizing. But what we've also been witnessing in France, because the UNHCR had this study with a bunch of companies, is that when you ask employers, they are willing to work with refugees, support them, but also hire them. So like there's this disconnect between the public discourse and what might happen on the ground if you give the tools and the opportunities and the information to different stakeholders. So we need to work with that, those positive things that we see in these different areas. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good note to end on, which is a ray of hope in this space. So thank you both again for a great discussion. Thank you all for coming here in the room, online. Those of you who are here, please join us for a reception. Today, we have a special treat for the reception, in addition to the usual, which is some refreshments from Damascus Rose Kitchen, which is a local social enterprise that supports refugee women here in Oxford. So join us for the reception. And then also, I hope you'll join us next month on February 9th. We'll be talking with Karim Harji and Jeremy Spafford about meaningful impact measurement. Thank you.